Rooks belong behind passed pawns. This is a game from 1941 where Botvinnik is white, and Botvinnik knew that rooks belong behind passed pawns, and white played rook b1, so that his rook is indeed behind his passed b pawn. If he hadn't have known that rooks belong behind passed pawns, he would have hopefully seen as a second best that if he brings his rook forward thinking that his rook belongs at the side of his passed pawn, he's going to get checkmated very quickly. Well, he's going to lose his rook and then get checkmated. So he might have instead played h3, but then the player with the black pieces would probably have known that their rook also belongs behind passed pawns. So, I mean, the title of this video is Rook endgames, balance on one wing, rook behind passed pawn on the other wing. And so, yeah, rook b1, our rook is behind that passed pawn. It's just sort of a curious quirk of the way that chess games end up playing out, that it's much more frequent that our white rook gets stuck in front of our passed pawn. And the Dvoretsky endgame manual has got a world of positions that need studying on that. It's like pages and pages and pages, and no idea how long it's going to take me to get through it. But much easier to understand are the positions where you can get your rook. Sadly, less frequent these positions occur, but they do occur, and they're much easier to understand, these positions where you can get your rook behind the passed pawn. So that's the first rule to follow. Rooks belong behind passed pawns. The second rule is that if you're the defending side, this passed pawn needs blocking as soon as you can. So black should play rook c6 here. b5, rook b6. Okay. And then what you would want to do as the black side is get your king over there as quickly as you can and somehow work out a way to swap the rook and the king round. Because the rooks can move many squares, whereas the king can only move one. You do not want your piece that can move many squares blocking a passed pawn. You want it to be active. So that's the next rule that you need to follow. One thing I would say about this whole section in the Dvoretsky endgame manual, this sort of balance on one wing and a rook behind a passed pawn on the other wing, is that if you sort of just play the principled moves, you know, your rook belongs behind the passed pawn, block the enemy passed pawn as soon as possible, get your king blocking it, not your rook, all that sort of stuff, then it does seem to sort of coincide with the desirable results. The reason we love chess is that it doesn't follow the rules. It's not just formulaic the entire time. But sometimes that can be a bit of a headache, where you learn like a rule to do in a particular position, and then immediately you just get met with a position that doesn't follow that rule, so you just sort of end up sort of a bit confused as to what it is you're actually learning. But this section was much easier to go through than, for example, the last section that I did a video on, which was just a pawn majority on one side of the board, like a 4 versus 3 on the king side, for example. This was much easier to understand why both sides were playing those moves, and much easier to see that the principled moves did lead to the desired result that those moves were sort of intended towards to lead towards. So that's what black should have done. Okay, so a quick reminder, Botvinnik gets their rook behind the passed pawn. Black should block that as early as possible, as high up the board as possible from black's perspective. So rook c6 was the move to play. In this 1941 game, the player with the black pieces played king f7, and Botvinnik just pushed the pawn. You know, every time the black rook refuses to come back, we can push the pawn and just tie the black rook down for as long as possible. I'm sure some counting was going on already here. So Botvinnik pushed the pawn again, b6, and after rook c8 he paused. He didn't push the pawn again. I'm reasonably sure he would have calculated whether he can still push it from there. Because as you look here, the black king's actually, alright, white's got a passed pawn, it's about to tie down the black rook. But the black king's pretty much in the middle of the board now, and the white king's still stuck on h1. So time to get it out. And I mean, if he didn't count on the last move, I'm almost certain he would have counted on the last move before he played b6. He absolutely counted that b7 only leads to a draw, because black has only got time. Black has now got time to bring the king over, take the b pawn, and if the rooks are swapped, the black king's got time to get to d7 and stop the white king coming in and playing Pac-Man with those pawns. So he paused here and didn't play b7. Okay, I mean, I don't think that's too hard to sort of count out, and I think you should have done a similar counting back here before you push the b pawn at all, because it might have been that that's already messed it up. So h3 played. I mean, the engine's screaming out to play h4 or g3 or just king g1. It doesn't like g4 for some reason, which I was meant to investigate, but didn't get round to in my prep. It gets in the way of the white king there, maybe, or maybe it allows h5, so that you either get two doubled rook's pawns, which turn out to be a bit useless later on, or it allows black to swap one of the pawns. The defending side always wants to swap pawns as much as they can, so maybe something to do with that, I don't know. But h3 played. Rook b8, king h2, black king comes over. I mean, that king really is in the centre of the board now. King g3, king c6, and then king g4. And now that pawn can't be taken, because if that pawn's taken, the rooks come off, and there's nothing stopping the white king coming into f7. Notice white's last move there. It was unnecessary. King f4's basically just as good. But I think I know the reason that he didn't put his king on f4 is just unnecessary. Like, this is a path to f7. f7's where you want to go. And this is a path to f7. They're the same distance. So why not just play king g4? You know, because king f4, I mean, it's perfectly fine, but it allows rook f8 check at some point. By the way, if your rook was blocking that passed pawn just like adjacent, one thing that you want to do as a defender is swap your king and your rook round. But as soon as you go to do that, you might lose a rank on the pawn, because white could just push it, or you might just sort of end up being forced to swap the rook straight away. So one thing you can do is deliver a check and then hop in with your king. All of that's irrelevant here, because the b7 square is free. But king g4 played anyway, king b7. Now what would you do as white? This is a pause the video moment if you want it. Obviously we're eyeing up these two pawns. We've temporarily tied down the black rook to stopping our passed pawn on b6, but black has successfully marched a king over to b7. Alright, the black king's out the game, but our rook's a little bit out the game defending the b pawn, and the black rook is now free. So how are you going to get at these two pawns? For example, the sort of primitive king f5, rook f8 check, king e6, rook f2, that's just a draw, because you can't defend these pawns now against this rook unless you bring your rook over, but then your b pawn's falling. So you can't do that. But what Botvinnik played, and there's lots of winning moves all based around the same idea, but he played rook e1. Really clever move, because if king takes b6, the rook comes back to b1 with check. We swap the rooks on b8, and there's nothing stopping that king march to f7. So the b pawn can't be touched still. We're also threatening rook e7 check, where we don't really care if the b pawn goes, because we're gobbling up those two. And it's I know there are some positions on that video I did on the Kasparian position, where you've got a knight and a rook's pawn, rook and 2 versus a rook. But the black king is just miles away on b6. It's an easy win for white. So black's got to do something about that. And rook g8 was played in the game. Botvinnik then just defends the b pawn, rook e6. And black's got nothing. All they've got now is waiting moves. They don't really, I mean, their rook's tied down to the g pawn. They don't want to resolve that position by starting to weaken their pawns here. Resolve that situation, sorry, by trying to weaken their pawns here, because as soon as they do, the white king will come in. So all black's really got is waiting moves. This isn't really a waiting move. White can make progress again with Rook e7, tying down the black king to the back rank. So a more sensible waiting move is the one played in the game, king a6, king g5, black waits. And watch the way that Botvinnik doesn't hurry here. In the endgame, do not hurry, because black's just completely tied down. H-pawn to h5, black just waits. Okay, g-pawn advance, black continues to wait. King out the way, king onto h4, then the h-pawn is pushed. I mean, what does black do here, to be honest? They're in big trouble. G takes h6 played in the game, rook takes h6, rook g7, king to h5, black waits, and now, I mean, one simple winning plan is just rook here and, rook to f6, g5, and bring the king in, but once the king's gone to a6 as a waiting move, rook c6 can be played, because now the king can't come back to b7. If the king comes back to b7, we'll see a rook swap on c7, and that's clearly completely won for white there. So black now has to leave their king on a6 and just wait around with their rook. Rook e7, but white played rook c7 anyway. Black stuffed. Rook e5, check. G5. I mean, black could have resigned here with a clean conscience. King c6 played, king h6. Black desperately tries to get their king across. G-pawn push, rook down the back, rook f7. I mean, we've got a horizontal cutoff here. We've got a vertical cutoff. I mean, depends which way you want to view it. King e6 played. Botvinnik wanted to view it as a vertical cutoff. And black played rook a1 at the same time as resigning. So yeah, rooks belong behind passed pawns. It's a really nice demonstration of how to convert such positions. Just the black force is tied down to the defense of this. The rook tied down for just long enough to make some progress, and it was converted incredibly well, actually. All really instructive stuff. Right, next, this is a game from 1955. Botvinnik is white again. So 14 years after that first one. I don't know if he remembered it and thought, right, well, in that game, black should have blocked that passed pawn as early as possible. Oh, by the way, it's not a draw. It was still just... Where was the position? That position there. If they block, it's still winning for white, but black would have stood maybe better drawing chances, blocking this passed pawn a bit earlier. And in this position, the move that white now played, the engine evaluates as -0.5. Everything else is -3. So basically, by not playing rook a4, by not blocking the a pawn as soon as possible, it's the equivalent of pretty much giving up a piece. Okay. And every single other move, other than rook a4, black's next move is a4. I mean, just look at the rook on a4. And that's such a useful rank to control. The black king now cannot come to that rank. Black played king g5. Now this was criticised at the time because the only way that white can do anything in this position is they've desperately got to try and create some counterplay on the king side, because black's plan is simple. Okay, if you do nothing, my king's coming to b5, and then my king and my pawn are going to come down the board and win your rook. And that's happening, by the way. If that was black's mission, all they've got to do is win the white rook for their a pawn. There's nothing white can do about that. That rook is getting won for that a pawn. So the only way that white's going to get a draw out of this position is they've got to, you know, fight like hell to get some counterplay on the king side, and hopefully, as the black king comes offside, be able to do something to create a passed pawn of their own. And I guess they're sort of praying for a drawn version of rook versus pawn. So the reason this move was criticised is it runs into the counterplay a bit. So in the game, f3 was played, then king f5 was played, and then g4 check was played, and straight away, I mean, that comes with check. So black doesn't really have the option of ignoring it as easily as if they played king round this way, king to g7. As it happens, the engine just thinks they're much of a muchness, you can play either. Now, if you get the Dvoretsky endgame manual, which there it is, I keep recommending everybody do. It's a brilliant book. It's an extremely hard book. I mean, as you know, I'm in the middle of a project to keep going through it. I have no idea how many hours I've spent on it now, and I dread to think how many more hours I've got left to go just on Rook endgames alone, but I'm determined to keep going through it and hopefully going to keep learning stuff. In that book, if you get to this position, you'll see there's like almost a page of analysis just on this king g7 move, and I decided, especially after the last video with all those variations, I decided not to bother going down that road. But I was interested in this idea that if white tries to create some counterplay on the king side, fine, that's the rule that we're following. What if black just sort of ignores that? So what I did was I went for like a primitive approach as black. I'm just going to bring my king to b5 and just clicked on the engine's best moves for white, which were king g2, and there's the b5 square that I'm heading for. So I'm going to go to b5 just to see what does Stockfish do if I just employ this primitive plan. g4, and I thought, all right, well, I can't ignore that. I'll take that. King takes g4. My king's still coming to b5. f4, whatever. King c5. h4, don't care. King b5. Then rook d4. I'm like, right, well, I've shifted your rook off the a file. I'll start pushing the a pawn. Not sure where your counterplay's coming from. f5. Okay, I have to deal with that. All right, I'll take it. King takes f5. A pawn's getting pushed. h5. About to get a queen. What are you doing? Rook d1. Queen takes. Drawn version of rook versus pawn. This king's miles away. Now, yeah, that wasn't particularly sophisticated. It was just a very basic. What are you going to do if I just go for this basic idea? But I think often that's quite an instructive way to go about things. You just sort of go for a basic plan and see what the engine does, if you like, and where does this counterplay coming from? This idea of generating counterplay. Well, there it is. There's the draw, basically. The black king's miles away, and then that leads you on to sort of more sophisticated ideas, some of which we're about to see in the variations on the game. But there's a whole world of variations stemming from king g7, all very subtly different from the king g5 stuff that happened in the game. And I've just decided it's too much. I'm not gonna go down that road. But yeah, buy the book and go down it, obviously, if you want to. So f3 played in the game, and I guess the idea is as the king comes across, f3 has prepared g4 check. Pushing the f pawn, not the h pawn, precisely because we want to get a passed pawn on the h file. So we're going to create that sort of asymmetry. I mean, the last thing white wants on the king side is symmetry. Symmetry leads to, hold-ups and drawn type stuff. And drawn type stuff on the king side isn't good because black has one type stuff on the queen side. So the fact that g4 check's coming might make you think to play f5 instead. King f2, king f6, h4. The black king's coming over to b5. G4, here comes the counterplay. Swaps. King comes over to c5. White king follows it for a bit, and after king b5, rook e4. These variations are quite hard to follow as well, to be honest. Black can play rook c7 here. That's the best attempt at a win. The idea being that when white swaps the h pawns, or the gh swap, rook e5 check would now be met by rook c5. It's still not really a win. But a better move white's got to realise the draw here is rook e8. He's like, well, what's so good about that? I'll just push my a pawn. Well, rook e8 has done nothing. Check. Move my king. Check. Fine. My king's coming down the board. My king's supporting the pawn. You run out of checks. Now what are you doing? Rook b5. Oh. Oh yeah, that's quite good. Rook has to come to h7 to defend that. Or if the h-pawn goes, then we're easily going to be able to march our king over to h4, maybe even keep it on this side of the board. But I'm sure there's different possible drawing ideas there. But yeah, we can then earmark once our king's made contact with the h pawn, we can earmark our rook for the taking of this pawn. Or if black stops us doing this, we might be able to come back and box the black king on the a file. We might not even need this pawn to draw it with our king this close to the action. In fact, I think that's probably the case, isn't it? It's 4 files, isn't it? You need a 4 file vertical cutoff. So that's probably drawn once we've grabbed the h5 pawn, even without our h4 pawn. But yeah, that was and again, there's lots of other stuff you might look into after f5, but that was one possible line. So in the game, king f5 played, and then here's white's counterplay. Okay, now that move was criticised again because it's like black's playing into white's hands of allowing the counterplay, and should just ignore it. And if those pawns get swapped, fine. There's still more pawns left on the king side, and maybe a bit of symmetry as well. It still reckons white can draw this, but not as easily as black playing into their hands with hg, fg check, and now king e5 played. But what if, instead of just sort of politely carrying on with like, right, I'm coming over to b5, you better get your counterplay on the king side going. Remember, we've still got a rook supporting a passed pawn, with the white rook acting as a blocker. And the white king's still stuck on g1. So black might think, well, hang on a minute, I'm staying over here. I think I'm actually stronger on the king side now. I'm coming into the h4 square. So what does white do here? A curious line that gets analysed in the book. I'm not sure why particularly, because this is not a move I would ever think to play in a million years. I appreciate we can't move the rook. So the natural move that comes to me is h3. And we'll see in a minute that's actually absolutely fine. But apparently historically king g1, just a waiting move, just saying, well, you've got nothing here to black, was considered to be good. King h3, and this move looks even sillier. He's like, please come and checkmate me. And black's like, all right, I will. Rook e7. But this was considered drawn historically, apparently. Rook a3 check, king takes g4, rook takes a5. It's not drawn because of king f3. I don't think that we need this variation in the book at all. And something that's very amusing as you read through this book is that it's pretty clear, if you like, who his friends were when he wrote it, and who, maybe they were his friends, but who wound him up. Because every now and again he'll just sort of say, oh well, so-and-so says this, but it's very surprising that they said this, because this is just lost. So he kind of rubbishes the analysis of some of his fellow grandmasters. I won't say which ones he rubbishes and which ones he doesn't, but there is a theme. There are certain people they must just wind him up, or must have just wound him up at the time. So I think that's the only reason this variation ever got into the book. It's like, so-and-so said you could play this, but they were obviously an idiot because of, look at this. After king f3, white's dead. But then, apparently Botvinnik, he was fine, apparently, he never said anything silly, suggested h3, that's also the move I would have suggested, but I very much doubt, because I'd analysed it as deeply as Botvinnik, but it's definitely the move I would have suggested. g5, king h2, and, black goes for the sort of the coming down checking the white king, but that's the a pawn gone. And all right, your h pawn's gone and the black king's in, but you're going to go and get the black f pawn. King takes g4, rook takes f6, king g3. That's a knight's pawn. First rank defense is fine. So it does just sort of hold together after this king g5 try. I mean, I think if you were playing this in a game, the idea of analysing all of these variations, it's just, for me, it's just impossible. You know, it's like, oh, if I play, you know, if you think back here, I'm fine with rook a4. Like, yeah, I can do that. King g5. Right, I need some counterplay on the king side fast. f3. So when he goes king f5, I'll play g4. Takes. That looks good. I might get a past h pawn in a minute. He might play king e5. He might play king g5. He might be coming over here, in which case I'll try and get this past pawn. If he comes back here, I'm not sure. Maybe I'll bring my king in the game. It might be lost, but it's just there's too many variations going on for me to analyse every single move. But the point is if you just sort of do nothing from here, you're going to lose. So you've got to try and do something. You've got to try and get some counterplay going on the king side. I'm sure there are similar positions we could set up where even if you try and get some counterplay on the king side, you've lost anyway. So it's not going to change what you do. It's not... For me, it's not the time for calculation. It's just the time for... We've got to create some counterplay on the king side. There's calculating it and realising I've lost, or calculating it and realising I've drawn. Does it matter? Because this is what I've got to do anyway. You might not agree with that. You might think, kind of. It'd be nice to do a bit of calculation. I don't know. I mean, a balance has to be struck, I suppose. Yes, the king's gone this way, and there you go. The king's coming to b5. So Botvinnik, remember, is defending this and is just pushes the h pawn, just creates that passed h pawn. Now at this stage, black's got a couple of approaches. They can either keep coming over to b5. Okay, and maybe you can start to see we've got a drawn version of rook versus pawn coming up there. The white king, by the way, is still not in the game. This white king hasn't moved. You know, not only has black got a passed a pawn supported by their rook, their king's in the middle of the board, and ours is on g1. It's just like, what? You know, create all this counterplay, well done, but you've still got your king on g1. Yeah, so black can either come over to b5, or now this stuff over here has happened, they might, as in the game, change plans and go king back to e6. And just saying that they're going to deal with the situation over there, and this is still going to win them the game because they've always got this. Let's look at what wasn't played in the game, which is king c5, h-pawn gets pushed, king b5, rook h4, rook h7, just block that h-pawn, check, just check the hell out of the black king, and then rook h4. Okay, we're either going to go around in circles, or the a-pawn is doomed, and you can see that this f-pawn is not going to win black the game. There you go. We wanted our king on g1, okay, because it's ready to go to f1. Maybe that's why Botvinnik left it there. That's probably only half a joke. So in the game, king e6 played. H-pawn got pushed. King f7. Now what you're going to do is white. This looks like bad news. This plan by black to come back and deal with this, and they've still got this pawn, and they've still got this pawn supported by their rook. Uh-oh. Bosh. Rook g4. How are you stopping my h-pawn? Oh. Oh yes, that's quite good, isn't it? I suppose I better defend the h7 square with my rook. King f8. Alright, I'll come and attack your f-pawn. Right, well I'll defend that. Okay. How are you stopping my h-pawn? Rook f4, king g8. The f-pawn got taken. Black pushed the a-pawn. Rook f2. Okay. Notice blocking that pawn as early as possible. King h7, rook a2. The white king was in the game, and the a pawn's doomed, and they agreed a draw. So yeah, really good defense in that game. It really doesn't look good, does it? The original position. Got to block the passed pawn as early as possible, and then just do everything you can to create that counterplay on the other side, and put black in a sort of dilemma. This was the dilemma, but in fact it's already drawn at this stage. Right, next, this is a game from 1925. I think Lasker was actually white in this game. It's white to play. What are you going to do? Because there's the passed pawn. Can you see it there on a5? I remember we're meant to be doing everything we can to create some counterplay on the king side. Although the king side being so blocked, the black king's not exactly got a route to our pawns at the moment. So one thing you might think to do is just come over and meet this black king's journey to, well, I suppose b5 again, isn't it? The square that the black king would like to get to make progress. So king e4, king e7. As soon as the white king hits the d file, black could play rook d8 check. If the white king changes its mind, it gets cut off on the king side. And that is an unstoppable plan. That rook's a monster on d5. So that's a situation where I guess where your rook's temporarily better at the side of the passed pawn just because it's doing such an incredible job in the centre of the board. And if the white king went the other way, sort of committed to being on the queen side, I mean, black can still play rook d5 and then decide what they're going to do next. But in fact, just giving up the a pawn and coming for white's pawns on the king side, at least one of them's going to fall. Rook a4, rook f2. The g pawn's gone. The h pawn's going to follow soon afterwards. And yeah, that's, I mean, the engine's got that as -4.5 there. So pretty bad news for white there. So this sort of king e4 trying to meet black on the, you know, in the middle, stop the black king getting to b5, doesn't really do anything because of this rook check, centralising the rooks. Very powerful rook on d5. So Lasker very sensibly tried to create some counterplay over here, g4, and incredibly, black took it. Very bad move. Okay. This position's on -2.5, and after that we're on -0.2. HG, the white king's in, and the counterplay has started. Whereas, oh my god, my chess is doing that thing where it doesn't let me scroll properly. Instead of that, if black had played king e7, what does white do? Swaps. There's just no way to create the counterplay. If king e4, the black king's coming over. We might think to push the f pawn. The black king's still coming over. Push the f pawn again. I'm going to try and get to the f7 pawn where this would be dangerous, maybe in a minute. King b5, rook a1, push the a pawn, and then, yeah, black rook over to g8. So that would end any hope of generating counterplay there with the king, because the black king's in contact with the a pawn there. So that's just completely gone. Or if instead white played f5 in this position, king e6, king comes into g5. This is quite a nice line actually. Just gobble up the e pawn, and when black takes on h5, king f6, unstoppable. Checkmate in one about to happen. You can pre-move a checkmate in one. How about that? So yeah, king e7. It's just one. Just ignore this. But black didn't ignore it, and there's your counterplay. Sorry. Here, black didn't ignore it, and there's the counterplay. The white king's in. So king e7, king g5. All of these are good moves by both sides, and the white king makes its way to g7. just in time for that f7 pawn to be defended by the rook, because the black king wants to come to b5. Now this is your drawing chance. Pause the video and work out what does white play here to draw this game. There's no way you're going to be able to analyse every single variation to the end, but you can see that it's a better move than not playing it. You can analyse the variations to the point where it's clearly the best try. So in the game, king f6 was played, and I mean black finished this off reasonably easily from here. But the move you want to play, if I can get this stupid thing to stop. It does this annoying thing where you go to click on the thing, but as you move the mouse, it scrolls up the page, and you end up sort of following it around and clicking on the wrong thing. It's extremely irritating. F5. Okay. If the g pawn takes that, you've already got your passed h pawn, and that's going to be enough to draw. But black might start panicking that they haven't got enough to actually save that position there, but it does just lead to a draw. So more sensible, of course, is to take with the e pawn, but then you push your e pawn, and the h pawn still passed. King b5, rook a1, f4. So it's a bit complicated. These are all the variations that you wouldn't necessarily have been able to analyse to the end, but the point is you've got this passed h pawn, and that's got to give you drawing chances. It is a draw, but seeing all that to the end, obviously incredibly hard. Right, h pawn goes. What are black's possibilities? Everything's drawn, but let's look at a couple of possibilities. If f3, then rook f1. I don't know if that was the only drawing move. White has lots of drawing moves here, but rook f1 is one of them. a4, take the f pawn, a3, back to f1, a2, rook a1, king c4, h pawn goes. I'm not sure why I've circled the white king there. King b3, h7, rook to a8, just sort of trying to get the white king far away. Rook e1, e5, king g7, e4, queen takes, and the rook can deal with those two pawns because there's no way for black to get their pawn past the third rank because it's going to fall with check. So that would be a draw. I'm sure there were other possible moves there that you could investigate. That was just one possible line, but that was after f3. Or instead, black could try e5 here, and then the engine reckons h6 is a draw, but rook e1 hitting the e pawn. A couple of things we could look at here: king c4, take the e pawn, king d3, push f3. That's the black rook gone. F2. Now white's only got one drawing move here, which is rook f5, king into e2, and then you have to check the black king. Back to d3, going around in circles. Alright, I'll come to e3, check. This time I'll hit your rook. What are you doing about that? Rook back to e8. And it's still a draw. Or back in this position, black might try a4. Then we can take the pawn with check, king c6, hit the f pawn, a3, take the f pawn, a2, and we're back to a drawn version of rook versus pawn in a minute. So yeah, no way that you'd have been able to see all of those moves. I forgot, in fact, where they even started. But yeah, f5 was the move to play. So king f6 played in the game. King b5, and we're going to see similar stuff, but black's just ahead, basically. Rook a1, a4, then f5. It's just too late. f4, h5, f3. This is how the game actually ended, h6. e5, rook e1 was played, a3. I'll come back to the where the rook e1 was played, look at some other possible defensive tries. Rook takes e5 check, king c4, rook back to e1, a2, h7, rook a8. If rook takes h7, then this would actually still be a draw, just out of interest, because there's 4 files separating the two pawns, and that means that the black rook can deal with them by itself. Okay, that's covered in rook versus pawns video. So yeah, not rook takes h7, but black can play rook a8, king g7, then f2, rook f1, and then a1 equals queen. Okay. Rook takes a1, rook takes a1, and this is a nice little finish, queen h8, rook g1 check. This is how the game actually went, because white's now either got to lose their queen for the rook or allow black queen into the game with check. By the way, if instead of rook f1 there, white had played rook a1, then black can just make contact with the a pawn, and king b2 is going to follow after taking whatever lands on h8. Let's go back to the bit I said I was going to go back to here, where rook e1 was played in the game, but you know, you might have been wondering, why didn't white push the pawn straight away? Well, black could just take that, and we've got two connected passed pawns coming down the board. I mean, they're hard enough for the rook to stop anyway at this stage, but we've got this as a bonus. If in fact, can whites? They need to play rook f4 there, even if black didn't have this one. And they can't. So I've got a feeling that even without the a pawn, black would be winning that. And if king f5, just trying to get the king back in, rook h7, defend your h pawn. It's the only thing you've got left. And black can just play f2. King takes e5, and then rook takes h6. And yeah, we can see that that's also gone. So all of this meant that after getting lucky here by black allowing the king in, that Lasker had to play in this position f5. It was just a better version of creating that passed h pawn than the king f6 played in the game, which was just too slow. I mean, sure, yeah, it might have turned out that f5 wasn't good enough either, but you can see you're creating that passed h pawn quite quickly, and as it turns out, and there was a lot of different variations afterwards to look into, but it was enough to draw the game. Right, couple more to go through. This position is black to play. What's your assessment of the position? I mean, you could pause the video and decide, you know, what's your assessment of the position. And once you've correctly decided that you're basically busted, black's in massive trouble here. I mean, one thing I do, it never works, but one thing I do when I've got a position that's just hopelessly lost is I look round for anything. Have I got any tricks, any last little traps I can set, just hoping that there's enough complacency over the other side of the board to fall into something daft. You know, is there anything going on here? And the fact that it's appearing in this video and it's made its way into this endgame manual obviously makes you think, well, I suspect there is something going on here. There is something more interesting than just black's busted. And far from being busted, this is just a cast iron draw. Incredibly, because you take the f-pawn. I mean, white's got to take that back, really. Otherwise, you've got the counterplay that you need. And why wouldn't white take it back, you might be thinking. King h5. Okay. White king comes to b8. By the way, this rook's not behind the passed pawn, it's to the side, but it's a similar sort of thing. The rook and the king are very close to guiding that pawn to victory, and black would have to move damn fast to create any counterplay whatsoever on the king side. No idea where it's coming from. And black says, well, I have no counterplay, but I also have no king moves after that. What are you doing? My king can't move. So if you take my rook, it's stalemate. If you relinquish control of the g4 square, to give my king a move. You dropped your a pawn. In fact, black might even be winning that if white is not careful. Just out of interest, if I just play rook b3, yeah, black's now winning that. It's just a draw. There's absolutely nothing white can do, and if white doesn't give up control of the g4 square, I think black could still just play rook takes a4. I mean, it's a kamikaze rook, isn't it? But, I mean, if we saw rook c4, do we have to play rook takes a4? No, we can still just move the rook on the a file, because I guess we've got the trick in there. In the next, we can even play rook b7 check. I was worried about relinquishing control of this, but this is also apparently a draw, because what happens after this? Oh, you can just go back to the a file. I mean, obviously, don't do that, because then you've lost the game and you've just given up the g4 square. Well, that's a nice little cool self-stalemate, isn't it? So yeah, this video so far, up until this position, have been about sort of stick your rook behind the passed pawn, block that passed pawn as soon as possible if you're the defending side. If you're the defending side, work like hell to create that counterplay on the other side of the board. Take your encyclopedic knowledge of rook versus pawn into all these positions so that you're capable of analysing and calculating all of those variations, or some of them at least. And then all of a sudden we've got a position where, yeah, all of that's out the window because black's stuffed here, but they have got this beautiful stalemate trick. How cool is that? That was a 1971 game variation, so it didn't actually happen in the game, but it was a variation that could have happened. Right, last but not least, black to play. Any chances of winning this game if you're black? Bit of a clue in the title of the video, I guess, in that it's meant to be rook behind a passed pawn, and we've got our rook in front of our passed pawn at the moment. So, oh, that's wrong, isn't it? That's not anything to do with the theme of this video. So, obviously, you don't get that during your games of chess. So, a bit of a clue there. Pause the video and decide what would you do next as black. So yeah, a bit of a clue in the title of the video, obviously, that we're going to be transferring our rook to behind that that passed pawn on a6 sorry, at the moment, but don't push it to a5. White would just take on e6, rook e4, rook back to e7, king f8. Rook belongs behind the passed pawn. Rook takes e5. All right, we're still a pawn up, but king f2, this rook defending this pawn from the side with the black king cut off on the back rank. We're not getting anywhere there. Okay. I mean, it is still objectively drawn after rook f4 check. King g1 was played in the game. That's a good move. If king e2 is played, then we're going to pick up the e-pawn, and now we have two passed pawns. Admittedly, our rook's in a bit of an awkward place, but we do have two extra pawns, both of them passed, and although the engine's only saying minus 1.4, that is still obviously much better for black. So king g1 played, rook back to f7, and in the game rook takes e6 was played, and then the rook belongs behind the passed pawn, and this is just lost now for white. Rook d6, a pawn got pushed, e-pawn got pushed, king over. White brought their rook back to d3, trying to get that blocking of this passed pawn as early as possible. King e7, king takes e6. I think I would have played a4 there, just to force the rook over to a3 a bit earlier, but never mind. We see it transposing. King d5, king d3, king c5, king c3. The black king makes contact with the a pawn. King to b2, so white's aiming to swap their rook for their king there, block the passed pawn with their king to get their rook out, make it an active rook. But then king c4, rook g3, trying to do some damage on the king side. A pawn gets pushed, can't be swapped because the black king is off to play Pac-Man. So king a2, look how passive that white king is now. And then the black king came back over to the king side. A few more moves were played and white actually just resigned there because there's nothing that white can do. They're just missing a piece. They're missing their king in the defence over on the king side. So it worked, basically. The rooks belong behind passed pawns worked, and black won from there. However, white shouldn't have taken the e-pawn. This is still objectively drawn if rook e8 check was played. Okay. Rook f8, then take the e-pawn, so that when the black rook comes to a8, we'd see rook e7, a5, push the e-pawn, a4. I think what's white got up his sleeve here. Rook d7. Well, the thing they've got up their sleeve is the e7 pawn push, and that could get very nasty with the rook d8 threat. So king f8, check. If king g8, you just go back to d7. So king e8, rook takes g7 check. That's threatening. Sorry, not check. Rook takes g7, threatening rook g8 check. Rook a5, rook c7, a3. There's the block, but we're going to get the king out into the middle. And yeah, there's just no way for black to make progress in that position. They can't get their king in to hassle the white rook, and they can't do any damage over here. So yeah, white can just sort of hold them up. But yeah, like I say, it worked in the game. This is how the game went. And I'll get it to the final position where white finally resigned, which was there. Right, that video has gone on way longer than I thought it was going to. Sorry about that. Hopefully I said something useful, as well as 50 odd minutes worth of waffle. And I hope everyone liked. There was 5 different positions. So that's balance on one wing, but rook behind a passed pawn on the other wing. Play the principled moves, and it will hopefully lead you to the desirable result.